It asks, "Are you ready to go live?" And I think to myself, am I ready to go live? Is there any more preparation? Am I ready to jump into the liveness? Well, sure enough, yes, I have coffee today. Pain is well managed. It's early for me, so the pain isn't too bad. Rarely have been drinking coffee even. It's probably been a month since I've made a pot, but today I woke up. I have 10 days left on a restriction on my vehicle. And I thought, boy, I need to finish this absurd painting. And even though my mind is elsewhere and I have all these things in life that I need to attend to and should focus on, I decided, well, I got caught up on this Arrvol uh, and blitheringGenius video. I only got about 40 minutes in last night, and it's like a 3.5 hour video. And I thought, well, I could either go to the gym and listen to this whole thing, uh, or I can work on my painting and kind of jump in because I find, I've known Arrvol, Eric Arrvol, wink, wink, for a few years now, and it's good to see his graduation into philosophy. I mean, the guy can pick up stuff, but he's mapping it very 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 quickly. And yet I think he overlooks. It's obvious he's overly zealous towards certain ideas that I guess intuitively or rudimentarily make sense to him. And there is a discussion that I had with him about Christopher Michael Langwin's uh, Sinifio difference concept laid out in his book, which attempts to make all elements of all things inclusive in a top-down, God-led, God-knowing everything on ontology. And it was an interesting back and forth, and so at the same time, I don't think Eric thought that I'm too radical or idiotic or clownish or broken, fragmented in my speech. In order to really get the grips on him, I know I've influenced him in the past, but anyway, point is the video is really great. Meaning, so he's finally met this interlocutor that is, he's happily well tempered to the guy, and they're at least for this first 40 minutes have been able to walk through certain ideas. But ultimately, as I'm listening to the blithering genius guy, as you'll hear, as I'll start playing. I don't know if I'm even going to back it up. I might just play it here at 40 minutes and try to give you guys a synopsis of what I think the last 40 minutes are. But then again, part of me thinks, well, I might be painting. If I can get 3.5 hours of full painting in, I mean, stretch it out to 4, I might actually be able to make some headway on this big luggish painting behind me. Uh, which is all a clown act anyway. But nonetheless, so the blithering genius guy, he seems like he's more weathered through post Kantian philosophy, where a lot of Arrvol, like he's more of a classicist. He likes the old things, so he's kind of locked on to some of these ideas, and then he has this overarching attempt, belief, and or possibility field of reintroducing or trying to get some edging into kind of a an unnatural appeal towards the ontology of language or of knowledge. And even he framed the video with the word truth. I don't know if that's where they're going to lead it, but the blithering genius guy, he seems like he's read or gone through many more authors. And as far as I mean, there's kind of just this shit on the postmodernists thing going on. So there's kind of this like historic line in the sand that I think Arrvol's adhering to, that he just out of from extension and like Jordan Peterson hearsay on the shitbaggedness influence of the postmoderns on society, is, like, as Jordan Peterson scapegoats them. It's actually an embarrassment for Arrvol to just eschew and dissuade himself from reading the authors of what he attempts to call a pragmatic notion on language, um, where the blithering idiot guy, or blithering idiot guy, is not there. Anyway, I'm starting to figure out and try to prop up this phone. I'm playing it on my phone. Check this duty out. It's the Jackery. The Jackery is this new little power thing. That's the other thing I wanted to try, was see how many hours I get using that as a power source, even just for my phone. Maybe I'll plug my computer into it. Okay. Without further ado, though, let me back this up. Why not back it up? And then maybe I can do this in parts if it requires it. I have no idea where they're going after 40 minutes. I thought the first 40 minutes were fairly intriguing, where they are going back and forth. And it's about the 40-minute marker where finally Eric, I think, is going to starting his thesis on this. I can only get to 18 seconds, so I'll just play from there.
Yeah, it is.
And I'll go get a clown nose.
It is for you.
And start painting. Mm-hmm. We'll make some commentary.
Yeah, I don't see it. Wow, that's weird.
I hope you guys
okay, I guess I'm not going crazy. Skype is going crazy.
Here,
okay.
Let me know.
Anyway, all right. So
an alternative app to this. It's open source. You can also record.
Oh, what's that? What's a good alternative?
Jitsi, JITSI, I think.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll try that, because Skype not only is it acting weird now, but in the past, it has this tendency to over compress my audio for some reason, or it's probably some setting I'm not setting correctly on my end.
No wonder it jumped me to 2
but it doesn't have a notion of addition or subtraction.
All right. Oh boy, what have I done?
Is 6 a prime number? And then to answer the question,
hey, this phone.
Let me put it this way: we don't like.
We're just going to jump in.
The sense in which a statement in the formal language is inductive is that you have to learn the system of mathematics, right? If a baby doesn't have the sentence 6 is a prime number in its head, or 6 is not a prime number in its head, right?
But before they go on, I think just based on listening to both of them, that I've at least traversed authors, if I'm not able to articulate, that invite everything blitheringGenius is saying, meaning I'm almost in full agreement with what he's saying. And I think it's probably due to Derrida, Wittgenstein, and Donahue and Steiner now. Very, very heavily influential authors.
A baby doesn't have any sentences in its head. It has to learn a language. A baby doesn't have any notion of number. It might have the ability to distinguish 2 different objects of the same type. And so in that sense, it has some kind of, the innate properties of the brain that make mathematics possible. But it doesn't have a notion of addition or subtraction or multiplication. So the baby has no innate, no a priori knowledge about what is a prime number. The baby has to grow up, it has to learn language, it has to learn mathematics, and only then can you pose the question to it, is 6 a prime number? And then to answer the question, it will use the knowledge that it has acquired inductively, like from experience, about the system of mathematics to answer the question, right? So now within the system of mathematics, whether a number is prime or not is determined deductively. But the system itself is learned inductively, and it is applied essentially inductively, in that we have to experience the process of deriving the theorem to know that it is a theorem.
Right.
Okay, so that's
At that point, we need to clarify this issue of inductive learning when it comes to mathematics. I mean, Kant would treat mathematical sentences as synthetic a priori, meaning it does take time. There are mental operations that have to be carried out in order to gain that knowledge of the given mathematical sentence. But the entities that we're dealing with are not derived from experience.
And I think this is where Kant is wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, this is probably his biggest error.
Where do you find the number 3?
You learn the number 3. You're taught it.
Oh, okay. So how is it that someone is taught the number 3?
Well, you learn how to count, right? You're taught to count. As a baby, as a little child, they teach you 1, 2, 3, and they teach you the operation of counting, which is an operation of placing number tokens into association with objects. And then later you learn other more.
So now blitheringGenius is going to be using this current phrase tokenization within the language. Bill Grami's work kind of attempts to tokenize language. He's using it in this case as synonymous with numbers. But I disagree with the particulate argument that Bill Grami puts forward, meaning the way he particulates language this way. Anyway.
Abstract notions of number. Right? Like a kid will say, what is the biggest number? And that's a perfectly valid question for a child to ask. And it's only later that as you grow up and you expand your mathematical knowledge that you understand, oh, there is no biggest number.
Right.
You have to learn that.
Going back, though, you're saying this process of teaching the child to count, countability is already built into our cognitive modalities, just like you're saying certain logical operations are. So that's what Kant means by saying that mathematical truths are often...
Well, this is where he goes wrong, though. But this is where he goes wrong. He's not making a distinction between a proposition, a statement, and some that is within a formal system.
See, my side notes are about my notion is that Wittgenstein tore apart Kant. I mean, Kant's had several critiques since he was around, and Wittgenstein did a good job. So blithering, I mean, he seems like he's up to date with like a philosophy of language. The reason I was interested in making this video is because there were all sorts of these avenues and intersections, more so on the process of language analysis and the philosophy that covers it, that there's nuances and commentary that can be made. And sometimes, though, I mean, I may not be able to speak on while I'm doing this those particular nuances, but it would be nice to be in a discussion with these guys. Once again, though, I kind of want to jump in prematurely, but I'm just going to keep going because I think I need to change the speed up, though. I'm going to speed it up one notch just so it's not echoing too much of theirs.
The child has to learn
go from there.
And a mental process, like the ability to distinguish two objects as separate objects but being of the same type, is an innate mental ability. But the ability to answer the question, is 6 a prime number, is an acquired ability.
Right, but the way that you acquire it is by being led to the appropriate synthetic a priori processes. You have to deal with your own...
I think this is not true. I don't agree.
In order to discover how to deductively, reason mathematically, you have to be introduced to the intuitions that mathematics relies on at base. I mean, how did the first mathematician ever come up with the idea of numbers? It had to be built into the way that we think.
Well,
right? So you have a position where you can conduct these a priori processes, but you're not taking things literally from experience and manipulating those things from experience. Experience leads you to recognize.
So I guess what I'm saying is I think Eric is incredibly naive, incredibly naive. He's shotgunned himself into philosophy. He's picking up the remnants. He's starting out with the classics, but he's not modernized. So hopefully this brings that about. If you look at my interview with him about Christopher Michael Langwin on my channel, you'll see some degrees of the naivety, but he's young. He is jumping in. I think he's also reading lightly and not thickly through the authors. It's more like a bathroom book read, like a lot of people do. But we'll continue. I'm not trying to disparage him, because I think he's going to hit a crucial point at about 40 minutes. We're only 11 in.
The intuitive structure that is already there in your mind.
Well, okay, so again, there's a distinction between the formal language or the formal system of mathematics, which is conducted consciously outside of our, in fact, often on paper, right? We learn operations that are carried out on paper, not inside our minds. Operations that our minds are not even capable of. Like your mind can't divide big numbers. And yes, the processes, the steps, are based on innate mental abilities, like the ability to distinguish two objects of the same type, or the ability to associate tokens with objects, right? So we have this innate mental stuff, but that knowledge, that innate knowledge, is not propositional. It is performative. It is just there. We do it. We don't have it in a set of propositions. We just have it in that when you see 3 sheep in a field, you distinguish distinct sheep. So 3 objects of the same type. So that's innate. But the system of mathematics, which involves using these tokens called numbers to track these objects and then manipulate the numbers in certain ways to arrive at conclusions and all that, that's something we invented. And the explicit propositions of mathematics are sentences within a formal language that we designed, in the same way that chess games are sentences of chess. Like we can define the rules of chess, and then that defines the space of possible chess games. We define the rules of mathematics, and that defines the space of mathematical theorems.
Right. So there's a few issues here. First, when it comes to laying down axioms for mathematical systems, it's obviously not entirely arbitrary. There are constraints on the kinds of axioms that,
of course,
discoverable constraints.
Okay,
and I'm not denying that.
Where does that constraint on the arbitrariness of mathematics come from in your view? Is it those innate mental operations?
Right, exactly, right.
And is that why you would say that mathematics is effective in describing the world, because we're mapping our own logical processing, and that processing evolves to survive in this world, and therefore mathematics, which is a representation of our brain, works to describe the world as well? Is that what you would say?
Sort of. I mean, to some extent, it's the anthropic principle. Like, if mathematics wasn't an effective way of reasoning about the world, let's say it was like astrology, then we wouldn't use it to reason about the world. So, we have developed ways of reasoning that extend our mental abilities outside our brains. Mathematics is one of those things, because we have very limited short-term memory, and we have actually very limited ability to do math in our heads, as anybody who's tried to do it knows, right? So what we've done is we've designed something that we find, like each operation, we find intuitive.
Another common piece is that this very discussion, this isn't the first time that it's happened. I'm meaning, in history, it's so weird that the youth think that they're carving out new domains in discussions. And obviously, this very discussion is unique. But topically, this discourse between somebody that's holding a classical frame and somebody that's got, I call it I agree with Arrvol that it's pragmatic without being pragmatistic or pragmatist. But it's more of a natural description of language and the formation of knowledges. And so all I'm saying is that people, generations and generations have talked about such things.
Valid
discussions.
But then we can carry out a series of complex operations outside of our heads that we can't do inside our heads. Like even just keeping track of the number of sheep you have in a field. This was one of the earliest uses of tokens. You put pebbles in a gourd or something, and for each sheep, you put a pebble in, and then you could, when they come back, from the field at night, you map the pebbles to the sheep to see if any are missing. That kind of operation. So we have learned culturally over a very long time, thousands of years, to do all these sorts of operations outside our heads and to use external representation systems such as numbers to represent reality. But of course, the underlying basis of that is our innate ability to represent reality. Right. But then the other thing is that also it is partly the anthropic principle. Like if it didn't work, we wouldn't use it. So the incredible success of mathematics in explaining reality is kind of like
Right.
Sort of
that raises the fundamental question about which mathematical systems would work, right? You're kind of appealing to that this particular kind of mathematical reasoning evolved culturally because it worked. But what you're basically saying then is that there was a probability space, a space of potentials before we defined our mathematical systems, and that probability space had a range of values for mathematical systems that went from more useful to less useful. So the question is, we can discover somehow useful mathematical systems. The systems that are useful that apply to reality, would those have been useful and applicable to any potential species that was capable of mathematical reasoning, right? Would it have been possible to invent a valid system of reasoning? Would it have been possible at the outset to have developed an inapplicable system of reasoning? And if it was, if that distinction was real, then it doesn't matter that in actual fact we did develop mathematical languages. The point is that there were available mathematical operations that were, possible, and we found those ones that were possible, right? So how do you account for the existence of some languages being appropriate, some languages being inappropriate?
Well, okay, so first of all, the key point here, though, that we started with is to distinguish the formal system from the innate mental abilities and not to conflate the two, which I think Kant probably does. Well, I haven't really read Kant, so I don't know, maybe he doesn't, but I think he does, because I get that impression from what people say. And we don't have any propositions in our heads a priori, nor do we have any ability to drive any proposition at all until we have experience. So that's an important point. Nobody sitting in a cave, whatever, with no...
So where he says we drive experience, this is when I flipped and said a posteriori knowledges come prior to a priori knowledges, even though the history of the canon subsumes first the ordering that first you learn language, then you speak upon how it is you know things by experience. Anyway, back to this.
Experience of culture or of the world is going to form a proposition. The brain does not have propositions in it. Like, propositions are something that are ideas that depend on background knowledge that is learned from experience. And that's true for mathematical propositions. That's true for something like there's milk in the fridge, or the earth goes around the sun. So all of those things depend on experience. None of them can be derived prior to experience. So that's an important point. You may not agree with that, but that's one of the points I'm making. So I just wanted to be clear.
I get what you're saying. The implication would be that things can only be true or false. A proposition can only be true or false to an individual, and that proposition has to be built up in their mind through development, right?
No.
Well, I don't know what you're saying by true or false to an individual.
Incorrect.
I mean, we use the terms true or false.
Where does the proposition exist? If it exists in the mind, then saying a given proposition is true is only ever saying it is true for this individual who has formulated this proposition. Because if the proposition doesn't have an external existence beyond that individual, then it can't be universally true. It can only be true for that individual.
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by true. So, but also, when we're talking about formal systems, we're talking about propositions that are explicitly represented in language. So they exist outside of...
The proposition is the meaning of a sentence.
Well, the meaning...
You can translate a sentence into various languages, and they can all express the very same proposition. The proposition is...
Wait, two things. One, the language, meaning my conviction, is the language is subjective, intersubjective, and objective. It straddles the subjective objective domain easily enough. You can recycle language on your own away from other speakers or symbols once you've acquired it. You're in a community of common language speakers, and so that makes it intersubjective, a shared grammar that you check amongst one another, that resides mostly within each node, but the objective aspect is watching two other people. Like in this case, I'm listening to these two. I objectify you. The phonic, the meaning, the semantic meaning is conveyed outside of me. It's conveyed by you guys to me, so I can reference you guys. I can speak about your language as an object. I'm pointing to the dialectic process itself. to the discourse itself. So it fulfills all that. Secondarily, there's this modern notion, because Google Translate appears to approximate very well other idiosyncrasies, and it can be agreed upon that there is an that I mean, obviously there's translatability, but to the degree that the domain of the approach to the most inarticulate, meaning if you're speaking a pidgin language to one another, that you want to say that there is a one-to-one translation, but in many cases there is not a one-to-one translation. There's translations of the spirit of a language, and I think that there's a bit of a naivety when people think that language is pure and translatable without edges of the inarticulate or the impossible to articulate. So the translator skips and traces and reapproaches different literalisms versus figurative respiriting of the language within their mother tongue, or the tongue that they're willing to translate. Once again, I think a naivety is shown by Eric in that statement. But
is an abstract entity. It's not a linguistic entity. It's the meaning that we interpret from a sentence.
Fine, but then in what sense does that exist?
Well, in my view, it does have a Platonic existence, right? I hold to the realm of forms. Basically, all mathematical truth, geometrical truths exist eternally. Propositional.
There is milk in the fridge. I can put that into a sentence. I can say that to my wife. She can say, "Oh no, there's no milk in the fridge. You're an idiot." I can say, "Yes, there is." So I mean, like, is that a Platonic? Does the proposition "there is milk in the fridge" exist in a Platonic realm, or are we just using representations, whether it's ideas in our minds or words, to represent something? I mean, I would say the latter. I don't think we need to posit some other realm of propositions.
Right. Well, the problem when you don't posit that, first of all, the example with the milk in the fridge, that proposition would have a Platonic existence, but it would be relative to your experience, to the experience of your wife, to the details of each of your memories, right? So, like, there can be Platonic forms of the relation between mathematical entities. There can be Platonic forms of the relation between, souls and individual human beings and things. So all possible relations have truth, not only because we recognize relations relativistically, but also because these truths of the relations that objects, abstract or concrete, have to each other, those relations are all kind of contained in the set of.
See, Eric believes in God knowing all true propositions. He's been caught up within the idea of free-floating Platonic propositions since linguistics analysis has been brought down to claims and propositions and claims of truth, attempts to get towards truth, right? That's why in my thesis, in my embedded contradiction book, I say retract, pull back on this chasing of truth, because you're going to run into this exact error that Eric, I believe, is going to run into, which is not an error. In one way, I'm going to capitulate later on, I'm imagining, to what it is he's driving at to some extent. But at the same time, he believes that since God knows all things, amongst all language, amongst all of, like, just the pragmatic secular process of developing a human and speaking amongst human communities, as a very grounded analysis, he's always, and this is the flaw between Kant and Wittgenstein. A lot of the philosophers that are attempting to investigate language and investigate the universe are stumbling through all sorts of variations in this difficulty of trying to eradicate the need for a top-down, like the necessity for God to know all, or a space where exactly everything in every semantic field and every counterfactual and hence every evil or hence everything is known top down by a God. And in one respect, I'm going to end up, like I said, capitulating to some extent to agree with that idea. And yet at the same time, the analysis of language bared out proves in my mind, it sufficely proves that there's more complexity than this kind of like a sheer but vapid attempt to say that God knows all true propositions, and then say, no, God knows all proposition, and then God knows all utterances, and then God knows all semantic interpretations and perspectives of all utterances, and that this resides not only above you and beyond you, but prior to you in this Platonic God form space. And I mean, if Eric was to read, take Wittgenstein, who critiques Kant clearly with Frege and Russell, and read, I don't know, like I'm sure blitheringGenius here, the guy that's speaking to Arrvol, has some of these precursors. Like I said, we haven't even got to the 40-minute marker, and I'm already jumping in and throwing out how it is I'm perceiving this conversation, because I've listened to it up until this far. We're only at 21 minutes, but I just wanted to express my disagreement, almost to pre-bridge a problem that I'm suspecting is going to come up in their conversation. But
of all propositions that are true, and so I mean, it seems kind of.
What is the set though? But what is the set of all true propositions?
That is the set of all true. What are you asking exactly? The set of all true propositions is kind of coextensive with the realm of forms. Right? So the idea is like a triangle has these given properties, and there are truths that can be said about that geometric identity algebraically, and the propositional meaning of the algebraic sentences that express meaning about those geometric entities exist in that set of all propositions that correctly describe the relations of these ultimate forms and everything which derived from them.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, what is this set of propositions? I mean, other than reality itself. So here's my account of there is milk in the fridge. Let me give my account of this without having to invoke any Platonic realm of forms. I have a brain. My wife has a similar kind of brain. We have similar sense organs. We have similar emotions. We have similar ways of interacting with the world. We have similar bodies. And we grew up in the same culture. So when I say there's milk in the fridge, because she grew up in a culture that speaks English, and she grew up with milk, and she grew up with fridges and all that stuff, her brain constructs a model. And then she can compare the model that I'm conveying to her with her own model of the way the world is. And she might have a model in which there's no milk in the fridge. Then she'll say, that is a false statement. Or else she wouldn't say that, but she'd say no, because, your son drank it all. Okay, so there's no Platonic realm of forms. There's a reality that we both partake of. We can both interact with, experience. We can both open the fridge, look inside. And we use representations in our heads and externally in language to convey or hold information about that reality, and to, in our heads, to reason about it, to predict things. Like if I believe there's milk in the fridge, that predicts that when I open the door of the fridge and look inside, I will see a container with milk. And if I pick it up, I will feel weight and hear a sloshing sound if I shake it. So I don't need to invoke a Platonic realm of forms. It's just there are brains and brains.
We need to go back to the mathematics example, because that's why I originally tried to direct the problem there. Issue with the independent existence of propositions and what bears truth in reality. Is it sentences? Is it our beliefs? Like, where exactly does truth reside? If you don't posit the independent existence of these abstract objects, propositions, then mathematical truth is going to be difficult. But like first, in this example with the milk,
is that the case for chess?
Is what not the case?
Well, I mean, don't you have the same problem for chess, the game of chess? We invented the game of chess. So
chess is a kind of mathematical structure, and there are true moves in chess, false moves in chess. There are things you can do, can't do. And you could say that we arbitrarily came up with the set of rules in chess, but it's just like you can arbitrarily come up with a computer program. You can't decide whether it's computable or not. So the set of valid moves in any chess-like game is going to be, in a sense, already predetermined by the possibilities of the basic logic of the universe, not just of our minds. And that is ultimately where our minds get their a priori intuitions of counting and quantity. It is from the nature of reality itself. So I think just describing everything the human brain runs into problems. But first, let's look at this example with the milk. So I don't want to go in a bunch of different directions. Let's try not to go to too many different topics and actually resolve before we move on. With the milk, at the instant that you make the claim, there are probably an infinite set of additional propositions which could be said of the scenario that are either true or false. And I can entertain that. So, for example, it is true that blitheringGenius said there is milk in the fridge. Outside of the truth value of the proposition, there is milk in the fridge itself. Or you could say it is false that blitheringGenius said that there is no milk in the fridge, and then many other kind of meta propositions that can be said about the scenario. And as soon as I look into that space of possible things that can be said about the scenario, I can identify all sorts of possible true statements, possible false statements. And if it's all dependent on what's going on in our brain, then what you're ignoring is the issue of all those potential true propositions that if we said them would be true, and if we don't say them, they're not true. If propositions only ever exist in our mind, then how can it be said that there is this set of true propositions that could be said and this other set of false propositions that could be said?
See, and this is where Eric gets confused right here. And meaning I think he's confused. It's a 27-minute marker. He's confused because he's stuck on the idea of language being subjective, one-to-one, like your consciousness is one-to-one with God. Like instead of knowing that you're within a culture of common, like your parents were of a previous generation and they inherited language and you inherit language. And so it's that inheritability and process community, objective community, intersubjective and objective community that puts the truth in check. It defines it. It kind of proves it. I think they'll bring up a flat earth notion here.
How do those all exist in potentia as potential true propositions? How can they be independent of our brain?
Well, I don't have this notion that there's some kind of brain independent truth or some set of true propositions that exists out there.
See, and that's where I disagree with him also, because he's on the other side.
And the representations are, truth is, the way we use it in ordinary language is kind of like the way we use a word like flat. Like, yeah, the wall is flat, the table is flat. But of course, if you look at the table or the wall in a special way, like through a microscope or whatever, well, it's bumpy as hell, right? So we use these terms in ordinary language, but when we're into philosophy or psychology, we have to start thinking about, the prior question is, what is meaning? What are we doing with our brains when we represent reality or talk about reality? And then we can, we have to understand that first, and then we can talk about what is truth. And I don't think truth is a correspondence between an idea in my head or an idea expressed in language and some set of true propositions that exists out there in some other realm. I think it has to do with whether or not that information
also includes that
is predictive of something. It's about how it will affect. Really, truth is a judgment that we make. We commit using a certain model to represent reality and base our actions on that model. So, if there's milk in the fridge, then I don't buy it at the grocery store. But if there's no milk in the fridge, then I do buy it at the grocery store, right? So I'm committing to one of those models when I make that decision, right? So when we say this is true or this is false, what we're saying is, okay, for practical purposes, is this statement adequate for generating action, or will it generate confusion and surprise if I commit to it? If I commit to believing there's milk in the fridge and I open the fridge door and there's no milk in the fridge, then I believe that I'm wrong. So we have this
limited conception of truth. It's similar to a verificationist idea of truth, where truth is only that which can be kind of tested, right?
Well, I'm saying there really isn't truth in the sense that you want it to be, like some kind of objective truth. There are models, and the models work or they don't work. And that's why I brought up the epicycles. Were the epicycles of the Ptolemaic model of the solar system true or not? Is the model that everyone sees in a textbook true? The one where the Earth goes around the sun in a kind of circle or ellipse? Is that true? It's what does that mean, right? In a sense, it's true. It predicts what we observe, but viewed from the perspective of somebody who is in the Andromeda galaxy or whatever, some other perspective, the Earth is going, around the Milky Way with the sun spiraling through space, not going around it in a circle. So, right? I mean, I think you're kind of begging the question that there is this notion of objective truth that is based on a correspondence between propositions that really exist and ideas in our head. And then you're saying, well, if you don't believe in a Platonic realm, then this notion of objective truth goes out the window. And I say, yes, it goes out the window. Yes. I mean, in ordinary life, we don't have to worry about those things because we're stuck in our little frames. We're stuck in a frame where, we don't have to worry about whether we're going around the Milky Way galaxy. But yeah, there is no objective truth. There are models that we construct from our perspectives and we use them. And some of them are so general, like 6 is a prime number, or so tied to something that doesn't change, like mathematics, that it seems objective to us. Or they're so tied, like we can
see. I don't want to confuse. When I say there's objective, I'm not saying objective truth. I'm saying you can point to references that are outside of yourself, where the people performing the language function are objects. When they're saying objective truth, they just mean like a Platonic sort of pre-existing, necessary to the case sort of truth. And I do think that you can generalize and say there are generally these types of truths without committing heavily to like overemphasizing their truth after your absence, their truth minus the human linguistic description of said truths.
Verify them.
I get what you're saying. I mean, basically, it's a pragmatist theory of truth, and it runs into problems.
It's not a pragmatist theory of truth, though. I think that's like I mostly argued against that. But it's the pragmatist theory of truth is a vacuous circle. Pragmatist theory says something is true if it works, but how do you know that it works? Well, that's a truth judgment.
Pragmatic.
So there's no way you can choose truth, select a model based on whether it works. We select models based on information compression. That's the underlying norm of truth that is built into our brains. It's whether or not they compress the information of experience. Because if they can compress the information of past experience, then they can predict the information of future experience if the universe is ordered and somewhat stable. So that's what's going on in our heads. That's the norm we're optimizing for. It's not pragmatism, it's information compression.
But that view, it assumes things about the objective nature of reality, assumes that's how the brain works, in your opinion. And that's
right. It's a theory. Yes.
Yeah, so you're qualifying what is basically a pragmatic notion with an underlying correspondence notion of the relation of the brain to the rest of the universe and why those processes.
There's no correspondence. I don't know what you mean by correspondence.
Your description is in terms of a correspondence. You're claiming that the world is such a way, and the truth of that statement, the kind of truth it has, is it's a claim to a correspondence with the statement.
I'm not sure I know what you mean because there could be different models. Like let's say the heliocentric model of the solar system. It could be adequate for our purposes, but not, or even the Ptolemaic model with the epicycles could be adequate. And so for a time being, we could commit to that model and use it. And so to us, that's true, but that doesn't mean it corresponds to that the motions are actually epicyclic, like that their planets are actually going backwards and forwards and going around the Earth and all that.
Right. So you're describing a problem in viewing truth only in terms of predictive validity because we can predict accurately, and yet given more information, it may turn out that our models don't have as much predictability as some better model, like the relativity model or whatever. Again, you're relying on notions of a correspondence with a true state of affairs. You're saying there is a true state of affairs that our models are approximating. So the truth can't just subsist in the model itself.
Well, I wouldn't say there is
between the model and the actual reality, right?
I think that's a mistake, though, to think about it that way. I think there is a reality, and the reality affects us. So, there is a reality that corresponds to my representation of the fridge and the milk, such that if I, do this action of reaching out and grasping the fridge door and pulling on it, the information flowing out of my brain that causes that action will regularly produce a change in my visual experience, a change in my tactile experience. So one type of experience predicts another, but it all comes out of experience. So I don't have any access to this underlying reality, nor do my representations correspond to it. They simply represent it. And they represent it in the sense that they predict my experiences And the regularity of experience is explained by the existence of reality that is ordered and fairly stable.
That kind of representation, though, is a relation of correspondence. There's no model that doesn't represent the underlying reality, then it doesn't correspond. If it does, then it does correspond. It's sort of a semantic point. But if you're saying,
I agree with Arrvol, Arrvol at this point. There has to be a substrate of claimed there-ness or truthness, but I don't like the fact that he's grounding it on truth. If it's inaccessible or only approximated, then the idea of its stability is once again it's a stability that's called the truth. But I'm not in disagreement with Arrvol there.
There's a relationship of representation. That is a kind of correspondence.
What I'm saying, though, is reality is of a totally different type than the representation. So they can't correspond. They're incommensurable. They can never be compared, and I can never get to the ultimate thing. So, calling it a correspondence implies that they're of the same type, or that they're somehow commensurable, that we can compare one to the other. When in fact, all I can do is acquire more experience or compare one model to another, like my wife's model to my model. Or I could go to the fridge and get more experience that will then, invalidate my model of whether there's milk in the fridge. But I'm not leaping across the, mind reality gap, getting to the real thing and comparing it to a model. Nor do I have to posit that out there somewhere there is a real proposition that my belief corresponds to.
Well, given the problems that we've been looking at with regard to mathematics, I would say that you do have to posit that in order to deal with issues of mathematical truth. So I get what you're saying. First of all, it's a skepticism, basically similar to a pragmatic theory of truth. We don't really know what underlies the models, but models allow us to act. We can compare different models and kind of work on the basis of kind of what's adaptive in our environment.
To be clear,
the claim,
it's an inductive theory. It's an inductive, not pragmatic. It's an inductive theory, and it's empirical. It's based on experience, and it also assumes that we have innate mental abilities to induce knowledge from experience and apply it back to experience. So that's
fine.
the theory. I just don't want to confuse it with pragmatism.
It's possible to have a model of knowledge, though, which postulates a particular nature to that underlying existence. Right? You're saying we can't know what it is, and therefore our kind of epistemic notions of truth and falsity have to be constrained within our own models. But that's your theoretical prior. That's the nature of your theoretical construct. There can be an alternative theoretical construct which actually does hypothesize about the nature of the underlying reality. And if that gains additional explanatory power, then that would be an advantage. And I'm claiming that by postulating that there is a true nature of the kinds of things that we deal with in propositional knowledge, which are not all just concrete material claims. There are also mathematical claims. There are also counterfactual claims. And we can deal with the seeming permanence of mathematical truth, of logical truth, of claims about universals and counterfactuals by postulating the existence of this realm of form. So that's what it's intended to explain. So if we could go back to that issue of mathematical truth, if you're saying that we invent these formalisms, they're derived from our intuitions, basically the computational capacities of the brain. We expand on those through formalized systems. Before we formalize a mathematical truth for the first time, was it already true? That could you have said before anyone formulated the Pythagorean theorem that if you multiply the two sides by themselves, add them together, and then
a squared plus b squared equals c squared.
Yeah, I know. Sure. Set that equal to the hypotenuse, square it. If you could conduct these, assign a value x, if you did, counterfactual statements about this mathematical operation, would those be true before we invented that formalism? You know what I'm saying? Or
I'm saying that's a meaningless. I don't know what you mean by true, right? They were true within geometry. They're true statements within the system of geometry. They don't have meaning outside of the system of geometry. So to say that they're true in the universe, it just doesn't really mean anything.
I used this example in a recent video. Before a robin evolved, was it possible for the robin to evolve? If we're saying it was possible for it to evolve, we're saying it was true that it was possible for the robin to evolve. Right? Otherwise, the status of those potentials is totally indefinite. So was it possible that
It's weird because there's this idea of domains and fields and potentia or potentials of ideas presume kind of like a spatial notion that the potentia, or that which is potential, will arrive within a space that allows it, right? So there is such a thing as getting too caught up within this top down singular, right, that Eric and other religious folks get caught up in, because they'll grant over the God domain, hence everything falls within this domain, once again a field of potential. And then there's this idea of like an indefinite domain, platonic domain or field, that collects every possible proposition, and then somehow recursively reapproaches it to determine whether or not it's true or false in some earthly or some other domain, some other category, some other subsidiary domain.
You could correctly calculate the length of the hypotenuse given this operation with the given length of the other two sides of a right triangle. Would that have been true before the Pythagorean theorem was discovered? And I mean, because if you're saying that it wasn't true prior to someone actually formalizing it,
no, I'm saying it's true within geometry. So
yeah, but then you're saying terms is a human invention. So if it's only true, then how before?
See, my college professor in Wittgenstein, he said, look, before the round Earth, right, and this was a very direct idea. He said, before the idea of a globe Earth, was the Earth flat or was it round? And the correct answer to him was, it's a flat Earth, meaning that it takes the human formalization and propagation of the concept of a round Earth, not that the Earth existed in some potential to become round, just that human information only allowed it to be interpreted as flat. Therefore, before the world was discovered to be round, it in fact was flat, sort of claim. Once again, so much has to do with reapproach, revisiting, the waves relapping upon the same shorelines.
Geometry was invented, how could the Pythagorean theorem have had validity counterfactually? Right? What if we're saying that it was possible for the Pythagorean theorem to be discovered? We're saying that true statements could have been made about the potential of the Pythagorean theorem before human mathematics was invented.
Well, what I'm saying is that we have an innate, ability, or whatever you want to call it, predisposition. We have innate mental processes or abilities. The brain is not random. It's a structure, and it works in a certain way, and it does certain things. Okay, and reasoning about spatial relationships is built into that object, the brain. That's one of the things it does, right? It's one of the most important things it does. So we have this, innate, I don't want to call it spatial reasoning, but, we have this innate ability to represent objects in space and their relationships in space. And based on that, we developed this formal language of geometry that includes concepts like straight line, flat, hypotenuse, right angle triangle, and so on and so forth, within that system that is based on that, innate knowledge. So we have innate procedural knowledge of how to represent space and relationships in space. And then we constructed explicit representations, like the axioms of geometry, Euclidean geometry, based on that innate procedural knowledge, but it's not the same thing as it. You're not born with the axioms of Euclid in your brain as propositions. You're born with a brain that sees objects, and you learn from experience by moving around in the world how objects relate within space. You have the ability to represent objects in space, magnitudes, all kinds of things like that, innately, internally. And then you can construct a system that does that on sand or paper or whatever, and that's a very useful system. And it gets its intuitive correctness from those innate mental abilities. But something like the Pythagorean theorem is true within that system. Okay, you can't formulate the Pythagorean theorem. You can't represent it until you have the concepts of straight lines, angles, triangles, and so on, which are all,
Yeah, you're saying it this particular geometrical theorem develops from our innate capacities. There's two sides of this. I
I'm
want
saying geometry. Geometry develops.
Geometry evolves, but geometry evolves from our innate processing, or our ability to reason spatially.
Well, we
Right? That's how
constructed it.
it comes about.
We
Yeah,
don't have
I know that's what you're saying.
Okay.
I know you're saying.
Well,
So,
let me just give an
There are
analogy.
two sides of this. There are two sides of this that I've been wanting to get at from the beginning. We have to look at these issues. So on the first side, the basic reasoning abilities of our mind come from somewhere, right? And it was true that certain types of reasoning abilities could have evolved, and certain types of reasoning abilities could not have evolved. If you treat the brain like a computer, then presumably it is subject to Turing universality or quantum Turing universality. And so there are basic ways in which computation, ways in which cognitive processing can take place, and there are certain ways in which it cannot take place. That's my hypothesis about the nature of cognition, that there are certain computable processes that are possible in reality, and there are certain other ones that are not possible in reality. And the difference between those possible modes of cognition and the impossible modes of cognition cannot be discerned if your concept of truth is already embedded basically in your estimation. If the propositional knowledge is only yours and the true proposition did not exist before humans, that this particular mode of reasoning was possible for a being that would evolve in this way, then you can't make any sense of the computational capacities of the universe.
I'm not certain where Arrvol's going with this. Meaning, I agree with them here in one respect, but he seems still to be overlooking the advent of every predecessor that comes to develop mathematics, or all the people that are involved in the development of any formal game. Even chess has had its evolution to get to the modern form with en passants and stuff. So it's almost an overstep once again by Eric, or kind of like once again a reclaiming and a monopoly on a singular domain in which these things must occur, instead of like a pluralistic mishmash of complexity and complex systems emerging and integrating together. Even my notion on this video, on the word integration, and my integration, your integration as the listener, the integration of the knowledge. So there's a historic, chronological, very dispersed blips of people contributing, historically to the development of the formalizations in math, and even in formalizations in grammar, textbook authors who's claiming what's right and wrong usage in language based on what previous Middle English, Old English, old languages, pegged significant pegs within the language that one gets to develop formalization after the fact, or as an individual, not ex nihilo. I mean, you're embedded within the language when you grow up, but meaning for you to advent or invent or create, like Newton or anyone else, a methodology that describes or defines or attempts to describe and define something that's additive to the accumulative knowledge set. It just, somehow it just seems like Arrvol's trying to shortcut this.
Reasoning was possible for a being that would evolve in this way, then you can't make any sense of the computational capacities of the universe at large. And that's what I'm interested in the truths of reason. Not the truths of any particular mathematical formalization, but what was the true possibility of reasoning systems in the universe before humans set about what was truly possible in terms of computation and reasoning. That is the kind of archetypal Platonic mathematics that I'm interested in. Not like any
kind of
formalization
begging fallacy. We are here and we have brains that work a certain way. And then when we come up with formal systems, of course, the formal systems are going to represent the way the brains work, or they're not represent, they're going to reflect the way the brains work, because they're derived by those brains
from here on out
to do the job that those brains do, but do it in a different way, outside the brain and on paper and in ways that the brain might not be able to do. So they extend it. But there's no reason to think that the representations that we come up with, or the formal systems, or the innate mental processes themselves exist in the same form outside of the brain. Like, we don't know what reality is, and anytime you try to think about reality, you're going to construct a representation of it, and that representation is going to, it's going to be constrained by your ability to construct representations, and of course, your reasoning about it is going to be constrained by your brain's innate mental abilities. So there's no getting outside of that. That doesn't mean that.
No, I mean, that's why you come up with hypotheses about the nature of that underlying reality.
Well, but
right?
my point is
permanently embedded within human modeling, then you're not going to be able to talk about anything as being true or untrue when it doesn't have to do with human affairs.
Well, that's not really a problem. I mean, we don't have to talk about.
If you're hypothesizing the existence of that underlying reality, and you want to make truth claims about it to build a fuller model,
but you only make truth claims from
that allows you to say things about problems such as what are the generalized computational capacities of the universe, not what is a particular human able to do, but what could be done by any mind, any computing system. Thinking about that question.
Well, okay, so computing systems are, again, something we invented, right? They're not that much like minds.
I'm using it synonymously with the human mind, where I'm saying we're basically a computer. And so we do carry out computations.
We're not at all doing.
See, and now I'm agreeing with blitheringGenius that we're not, meaning every technology, when see, now since I took some painkiller, I'm going to be slightly more erratic. But since the radio, minds were then like antennas. Then when the TV came about, everyone was drawing the mind as a TV. Look, we're all just projecting. And now that we have a computer and we compute, then we think the mind is a computer. And then when we have the internet, then we metaphorize to the internet. Like, these are things that cultures do to attempt to remap or reanalyze. And it just sounds like, and I don't know, but I'm just predicting Eric's going to quadruple, triple down on the exploration for God as the general underlying stratum from which to kind of generate a singulitude, a singuloid from which all derives, and that's his interest. And so he's already tectonically separating himself off from that discourse of pragmatics in language. But let's see, we're only, just 1/6 of the way through, man.
Doing computation. I mean, this is a side issue, but the theory of computation is based on, basically, you have a Turing machine, right? You have some set of symbols, and you output some set of symbols. So it's about mapping from inputs to outputs, right? It doesn't take into account living in reality, like interacting with reality in real time. So the theory of computation is not really.
Look at Stephen Wolfram's models of kind of computational reductionalism. He actually ends up converging with a lot of my thinking, just from a very different perspective. But anyway, I mean, the universe has peaceful computation. And so if you want to deny that human brain is a traditional Turing machine, that's fine. I don't believe it either. I think it's a combination of quantum computation and a Turing machine and something else that is non-computational. Like there is a kind of essence of the mind that can't be described as a process. But
well, I just say even the computer that you're using right now isn't, strictly speaking, it can't be described in terms of Turing computation because that's not actually what it's actually doing. But I mean, that's a very abstract notion that was, it belongs to sort of the theory of computation and stuff.
Right. What I'm getting at is that the limitation in the concept of truth that you're putting forward is that you can't speculate at all. You can't come up with hypotheses or postulates about questions of basic counterfactual reality, meaning like the question of what sorts of minds could potentially evolve. You can't even look at that question.
Yes, because I can't get outside my head and partake of some other way of thinking. I can't directly get into contact with reality. So, like, what a lot of this stuff does, this presuppositional reasoning, is we look at ourselves, and when we theorize about ourselves, we discover, we can model the way we think, right? You can treat formal logic as a model of a certain aspect of the way we think, or mathematics in that way, sort of. But, we can theorize about ourselves, and then we'll discover, and you can also do this introspectively. You can say, kind of work your way back to the things you can't really deny or reject, like, I could question whether there's a tree outside the window, but if I see it, I'm going to believe it, right? But that doesn't mean, like, when we discover the presupposition of thought, that doesn't mean we have discovered an underlying foundation of reality. It just means that we have found our boundaries, or we have theorized about our boundaries, about our nature. So we're really theorizing about our nature. When we think about the presupposition of thought, we're theorizing about our nature, the nature of thought. This does not have to correspond in any way to the nature of reality. Now,
well, I mean, thought is real. It must correspond somehow.
See, in one way, I can agree with what he's saying, but I disagree, meaning the whole idea that you live within a very narrow spectrum of interpretation of the world, and hence your phenomenological interpretation of what we call reality is only a sliver or an approximation without ever getting it. That runs contra to how it is we learn what the word reality is. Reality is a one-to-oneness with the object universe as human, with even in the narrow spectrum, engages it. So that the way in which Blithering Idiot is saying it, I mean, this is commonly held that it must only ever be a brain representation and has nothing to do with reality, because we are intersubjective sharing beings. We can talk about excluded middle items like this is a painting. And there's very little reason for you guys to disagree, unless you think it's a computer illusion of a painting, or it's merely my mind's interpretation of what you're calling a painting. But it runs contra, and Eric's bringing that up with thought.
It's a reality. If thought is a part of reality, then there must be a correspondence.
Right. Well, yeah, and I was just about to say that to the extent that, yes, to the extent that our thinking seems to work, or, we theorize that when we represent reality, we are representing it in a way that is adequate for us to survive and reproduce and move around in the world without bumping into trees, right? So, yeah, I'm not saying that there's no relation. But what I'm saying is that those two things don't have to be of the same type. Okay, the reality does not have to consist of representations. Like it doesn't consist of sentences, for example, right? I can write down a description of
the
something
question can be asked. I'm going to give my epistemological position generally, and that might clarify some of these problems. The way I look at it, there are various questions that can be asked through experience. We have a problem that we want to address with an explanation, and an answer is better than no answer if you're trying to build a complete theory. Right? It's not that we have a firm foundation to know the nature of underlying reality, but if we can come up with conjectures, postulates, hypotheses about the nature of that underlying reality, then we can test out deductively the implications of those hypotheses and see if the implications of them correspond to experience, even if the basic postulate doesn't seem to correspond to experience, like atomism, right? That's a postulate about the nature of underlying reality that was put forward from a kind of deductive process originally, I would say. And from that hypothesis, then you can, if it's true that reality consists of these kind of basic material atoms, particles, then this other list of things may turn out to be true, and then you test the implications. But I disagree with atomism, but that's just an example of a kind of theory of underlying reality. It may turn out actually to be useful to come up with a theory of underlying reality. So that's the process that
we're always doing that. But the thing is, the theory of underlying reality is a representation. It's a model. It's in our heads, and it's constrained by our natures. We can't get outside our natures. We can't get outside our limits. So, it might be that there's some aspects of reality that we could never represent, never understand, because of our nature. It limits us. Maybe we're running into some of those. Like, maybe why quantum theory is so weird is that we just can't represent what's going on down there. But that's the limits of our knowledge.
Right? It's not useful to say maybe we just can't know. It's useful to guess. It's useful to try to know. Right?
Well, it might be useful to understand the relation between yourself and knowledge, to understand the relationship and the relationship between knowledge and reality, that we are limited. We're stuck in our brains, and also to understand that, not to confuse your theory about yourself and the presuppositions of thought. Like, if you theorize about, I might need space and time and causality and all that stuff, right? So this is how I represent the world. But don't confuse that with some ultimate knowledge of reality or a foundation. You haven't discovered a foundation. You've theorized about yourself. You've theorized about your nature. And I think this is where people go wrong. They confuse theorizing about your nature with discovering an objective foundation. And those are
that's not the perspective. I'm not a foundationalist. I would say that you have to come up with postulates about the nature of underlying reality, whatever it may be, and those can only be judged. The truth value of them can only be judged in the light of your broader theoretical framework, your broader philosophical worldview. And we can basically build on to these existing worldviews until we have a very robust set of theories. We kind of eliminate theories as they become inconsistent with data or with other, very effective theories. Like we seem to know that something is wrong with relativity and quantum theory in isolation because they don't seem to work well together. They seem incommensurate, the two of those. And so that's a piece of evidence that the general worldview containing those two particular theories needs updating in some way. But I wouldn't say that, I am supposing that we have a foundation for like absolute, no reservation, unqualified, pure knowledge. I'm saying we build up these models to explain problems, and we judge between these different worldviews on the basis of what kinds of problems we can address if we can explain data. And I'm dealing with right now in this conversation the issue of counterfactual knowledge. How can so I want to deal with the implications of counterfactuals relative to your concept of truth. In my view, if you let's say we exist not as human beings, but as like kind of just observers of a world before human beings evolved. If I turned to you as a disembodied spirit and said, it's possible that human beings could evolve here, would that have been true or false at that time?
Well, it depends on what kind of disembodied spirits we are. I don't understand what the question is, true or false. In what sense? Like, if we, I just don't know how to answer the question, because it's not like you're saying. Imagine that we are disembodied spirits that exist before anything happens here. So, what kind of brains do we have? I mean, you can't imagine being something other than what you are, right? I can't imagine being a disembodied spirit.
Basically, what you're saying is that without a brain to observe and interpret, nothing is true or false ever.
Well, I'm saying that there's no need to posit the existence of mind-independent propositions, because propositions, or whether they're in sentences or ideas in the mind, are used to represent reality by brains or by minds.
But that doesn't mean that that's exhaustive of what propositions are. Just because humans use propositions does not mean it is a purely human thing.
Perhaps. I mean, you could posit that there's some realm of propositions, but I don't see any explanatory power that would have.
It's dealing with claims of truth of states of affairs that don't involve human observers. So when we're postulating, or rather when we're theorizing about the existence of ancient Earth, before life forms evolved, we're talking about states of affairs that were true. We're saying this was the state of affairs, and all the propositions we can come up with that describe that state of affairs were either true or false. So first,
but what I can say here is we, as human beings, as brains, are representing the past using models, constructing models in our brains, and whether or not those models predict the evidence that we have, whether they compress the information that we have, will be the basis for us judging whether they're correct or incorrect. So again, there's no need to talk about whether it's true, whether it was true to some non-existent entity 10 million years ago. Like, what's the point of that? The only reason why you're trying to do that is because you have this fixed assumption that there must be objective truth, or these things must exist, and then you're just saying, well, if I accept your view, then they don't exist. Well, yeah, that's right, they don't. But that's all it is, right? Just you let go of that, and you're fine. There's no need to hold on to that. You can let go of it.
Well, it's not fine, because everything that happened prior to the existence of human beings, then you're saying
there was a reality there, but it doesn't mean that I have to believe the reality consisted of propositions. I think, yes, there was something there 10 billion years ago. That's my model of it.
Okay, so you're saying there were basically only facts rather than truth. So there were only like states of affairs.
No, there was reality. There was reality. Like, I can't talk about it without imposing a model on it, right?
What I mean by facts.
Well,
so we need to look at this.
A statement. A fact is really just a
I don't want to
proposition.
skip over this. Don't move on to something else. We have to look at this. So you're saying that there was only a reality. I'm saying you can describe that as facts or states of affairs. Is that what you're saying? The past, outside of human models, was a reality, and there was no propositions involved in that. Is that right?
Well, I'm saying there's no reason to assume that there were anything like propositions, existing outside of minds in some sense in the primordial world. That there's no reason to think that my representations that I construct to explain reality are the constituents of reality.
Well, the reason I would give is that we could then account for the veracity or falsity of relations between concrete objects, which in fact existed in the past, outside of just our modeling, right? Because you're saying there was a reality, there was a something, But if you want to remain totally agnostic on it, then what you're really doing is not generating a theory about it, right?
No, I have a theory about, the world, the universe. I mean, we can construct a theory which says 10 billion years ago, there was gas and dust in this region of space and had not yet coalesced into the sun and the planets. You can tell a story about it, but you're telling it from your perspective using your brain. And the story consists of representations, right, that you're using to represent something. But the thing that you're representing doesn't have to consist of representations. So that's what I'm saying.
Okay, right here, I'm just going to jump in and say, I think that I agree with both of them. The blithering genius, he's after my own heart as far as like, look, but besides some ecstatic relationship to this Godhead that Eric is overly dogmatically convicted to, which I am also in another manner. I also totally disagree with. I agree and I disagree with both of them, but it's not. That's once again the blithering is trying to put everything into the mind, into human minds, as merely a subjective and intersubjective state, where Eric is starting with the most objective for his postulations and working down different approaches to this, like the ontology of epistemologies. To be poetic.
And the problem you seem to have with this is that from an objective perspective, like the perspective of no mind, there would be no truths or falsities or such representations. Well, yeah, without a mind, there would be no meaning. Like if nobody spoke English, the sentence "there's milk in the fridge" doesn't mean anything. But there could still be reality.
Okay, so part of reality is not just concrete objects where they lie. It's also relations between objects. It's also possibilities that objects have. And if you don't posit the existence of mind-independent truths about those relations and modal possibilities, then like you're basically saying that there are no facts.
All I'm doing is rejecting the naive realism or the correspondence theory of truth. That's all. Doesn't mean I can't.
It's like when you postulate there is a reality there. The reality that we know includes relations, includes potentials that objects have, and we can characterize those potentials, those relations, really only in propositional terms. Like this, how does the state of affairs, how does the reality itself contain the information about its valid potentials?
See, I'm upset almost, meaning I'm unsympathetic to Eric saying that reality includes potentials, because then he says, no, it's only about propositions, then about the potentials. Well, the potentials themselves are not so much reality, meaning only when they're in action do they become reality. The potentia itself then is more like a mental state, a view of how cause and effect might be. But so Eric now is doing a little bit of a slip-slop here in this portion, because he wants to include potentials as real, right? It's potential that I drop this brush, but I wouldn't say that it's real until it does drop. It's only real is what occurs, not what lays behind the occurrence.
It's invalid potentials. How does it contain
Otherwise, he's
information
mixing the
about the relations that a thing has to all other things? It's
Well, I mean, all we can do.
I'm seeing here is a kind of like assumption of local realism. Right?
No, I'm just saying all the things you described, right? You had to put them into representations. So when you talk about a relation, you're talking about it. Or when you think about it, you're thinking about it. So there's something out there that has regularity, that has order, that makes the representations functional, that allows them to compress the information of reality. But that doesn't mean, again, that what's out there is the same thing as the representations, right? Like I can have a map of the city, and that represents the city, and there's a regularity to the city that makes the map functional. But I can't walk around inside the map and buy coffee at the coffee shop inside the map. I have to do that in the city. Those are totally different things. They're not the same, right? But one represents the other. And there's no reason to, just because when we look at the world, when we think about the world, like I use the analogy of a map, because both the map and the city are out there, right? But when we are looking at the world, we're doing so through ideas, through representations.
Great
when we think about it,
response.
we're doing it through representations, and we can't escape from that. But just because we can't escape from it does not mean that reality consists of representations. All we can
Right.
Entailment.
Yeah,
No,
okay,
but
sure.
obviously what I'm getting at is that there is explanatory power in supposing representation-like qualities, supposing that to exist in the basic reality outside of our minds.
What does that explain, though? What would it explain?
When's it
It would explain how it could be the case
Yes.
in that past reality that
No.
there were
Current
true
reality. Don't go past.
possible futures from its perspective and false possible futures from its perspective.
Okay, but that's not explaining something, because that's not an experience that requires explanation. There's no evidence. There's nothing to explain there, right? You're talking about, you're just insisting that it give you your presupposition, your objective truth assumption. You're not explaining something. You're not talking about something I observed or felt or whatever that requires an explanation. What you're saying is, I demand that my theory give me objective truth. Right? I mean, that is all you're demanding. This is what you want. You're not explaining something.
No. When we're
See, once again, I agree with that allegation against him that that's what he's doing, but it doesn't put out Eric's fuse here or his candle on the matter, nor does it mine. Like, it's an inadequate response, even though it's powerful.
hypothesizing about the existence of a past before human beings existed, we're talking about the nature of that past. When I look at the present, the nature of the present seems to contain, not just in my mind, like modal realities. There are things that objects can do and things that they cannot do. Those capacities and potentials aren't as straightforward than the simple like material existence of the object. The things that things can potentially do, or the relations that things have to each other. I don't think I'm creating relations in my mind. I don't think I'm creating modal possibilities in my mind. And so, if I'm not creating them with my mind, they do subsist somehow in reality. And the question is, how do those properties, counterfactuals and relations, subsist in reality? My theory is Platonic, and I answer the question of how those things subsist. And I'm saying they apply just as much in the past, when humans didn't exist, as they apply in the present. I'm aware that all of this is a model. So going back to, that's just a model, is pointless. We're trying to find the best model. That's the point.
Yeah, but the best model will be the one that explains the most of what we experience.
Right.
And
so let's address that question. I'm talking about counterfactuals and relations. How do those subsist in the world? Not just
counterfactuals don't require an explanation. Like saying, you're demanding that the theory give you that there is truth, like that exists. There's some notion of truth that exists without a mind. So that's not something that requires an explanation. Now, if you're saying, how can we, like, why does it seem that there are potentialities existing in a situation? Well, it might be that that's kind of an illusion, or that's a perspective-dependent thing.
Okay,
There's only one potential.
Let's go directly to an argument made by David Lewis, who's the biggest contemporary.
Let me just finish this. Like,
you're going over the topic instead of addressing the real issue. You're saying like it doesn't need to be explained, but it does. Because like in a basketball,
no.
we can say
What needs to be
explained.
explained?
Say things in a basketball game. I'm going about it. So in a basketball game, a player is about to shoot, and he misses the shot. The game ends. His team loses. From that perspective, we can say if he had made the shot, then his team would have won the game. And like if that is true, in fact, most people would agree you can make those sorts of claims. How is it that that statement is true? How can you make claims about counterfactuals that can be true? Or in a chess game, like if you had moved here, then you could have taken this piece, even though it didn't happen. We can say if you had done this, this would have happened, and the truth value of that proposition we can account for with modal realism, saying there are real.
No, it's based on mere agreement. Like, yeah, if he did shoot it, and if he did make the score, he would have won the game. He was so close to making the score, he would have won the game had he done it. Once again, it's this idea of the language. Like, I think Eric's conflating the word reality to include certain aspects that occur within the idiomatic dialogue, right? Meaning, because we all know cause and effect, we all know potentials, and so we can speak on those as counterfactual, but then to claim that they are then true and are of reality, then your optics are off. Now it's reduced now to the discourse, the agreement, the inherited community of speakers, and is not actually emblematic of the reality. Like the potentiality is, it's agreed to, but that's held in the linguistic net, not in the reality net. And so it's once again though, even like it's more like semantics, meaning, perception itself. Like because those occur, they're a part of our phenomenological reality. Once again, even a more narrowing of optics, meaning they're made subjectively and intersubjectively to the phenomena that we're experiencing. So that is real. But as far as the idea that I don't know, I think maybe it's my attempt to absorb the idea of counterfactuals as real. It's like Piro doing illusions exist, right? It's like counterfactuals exist, fine. But then it's almost like the drive to conflate linguistic concepts that map to the world and mistake them for the world and call it real.
Real capacities that objects have. So that's
well, we just represent possible futures. That's what our brains do, right? They're there to make choices. So we're always making judgments like, if I do X, then Y will happen. Okay. So we have the innate mental ability.
True or false? How can those propositions be true or false?
Well, that's not really an issue. It doesn't matter if they're true or false in what sense. They're just, it's just a belief that you have. Well, I think if he had done that, then he would have won the game. That's my belief about what would have happened. And you could debate that or whatever. I mean, I don't see how the Platonic realm would change anything, because in the Platonic realm, you'd have the exact whatever problem that it's a counterfactual. So it's a counterfactual.
No, because
the Platonic realm contained the counterfactual.
Contain that, like looking at Max Tegmark's multiverse arguments, like taking modal realism as the idea that counterfactuals exist in parallel universes, and therefore there are actual reference to these claims. So you can answer those things by saying,
well, you can't go to the other universe, and all you're saying is that there's some imaginary correspondence,
yes,
to some proposition that is totally out of reach to us.
Right.
But you're saying that's the meaning of the statement, that it's true, and yet there's absolutely no way to verify that. Right. So
you can't verify the statement that if Kyle had made that shot, his team would have won the game.
Yeah. How do you verify that? Do you go into the Platonic realm and go switch universes and go see what happened and watch the game from a different perspective?
No, the game has rules, and deductively, given if basketball has rules, certainly, yeah.
Well, it has patterns, right? I mean, it has patterns. Like usually, something isn't scored in the last 2 seconds. So if the guy makes a shot in the last couple of seconds of the game and it misses, then it's a pretty simple inference that if he had got it in, they would have won, and if he didn't, they would have lost, right? And it's just like, I mean, I don't see the problem here. There's no problem making those kinds of judgments, but it's a judgment made from our perspective based on our knowledge, using our way of representing reality. I mean,
I'm saying, like, okay, we have to go back to the idea of truth in the first place.
Right. Like, but again, this goes back to my point. You're demanding that this be objectively true, and I'm saying this is a meaningless notion.
Yeah.
So you insist on this meaningless notion, and then you say the problem with your worldview is that you don't have this meaningless notion.
The
I don't. Objective truth.
Okay, I'm not. It seems like you're conflating an epistemological limitation of human beings with the domain of truth within your theory. Like, what is truth? The answer will be a hypothesis. The answer will be within your model. I understand that, right?
No, but I'm saying I don't think that there is this thing of objective truth. They're just models that represent the world in ways that compress information, predict experience, and are functional for humans. So, I mean, in ordinary language,
once again, like Arrvol is after my own heart in the attempt, and yet the blithering genius seems to be laying it out. We're not even quite at the halfway mark on this, so it'll be interesting to see. And I haven't heard this yet, but it'll be interesting to see how it is they flesh this argument out as more time goes on, because I think blithering idiot, I want to call him blithering idiot, has made a point just about that. It's more like a willful insistence on this, and then it doubles down on this platonic, like a reapproach, like the main thing is the main thing. So keep the main thing on the main thing, right? And one can make a poetic sense out of that kind of rhyme, like keep your eye on the ball. No, really, when you're on the game, really, really keep your eye on the ball and keep your mind on the main part of the game. But it just seems to me like the blitheringGenius guy is really laying it to Eric, because it seems to be the case that Eric wants to appeal to a persistent and distributed, ongoing, not to be interrupted truth, potentia, that exists now, not here, but it dislocates into the Tegmarkian other universe, or any multiple universe that splits in any possibility field, which is so weird that humans even presume that where a universe would split is based on human decision instead of on any atomic difference that might decide one pattern opposed to some other pattern, right? So, I mean, both of them presume a oneness, the staticness of this universe as not being plural, and then to pluralize it, that's what I meant. Is Eric's after my heart for this attempt, because it's once again doubling, quadrupling, insistent in theory on the singularity of all things to bring it together. And since he's familiar with Langen, and Langen talks about like these recursive telic patterns, telons, meaning how it is you're projecting forward and like pre-prescribing your direction or possible directions into any future or towards an end, right? It's almost like this idea that one leads to a singularity, a composite of oneness, whether or not that's a human notion, or whether or not there is no composite, and some people die in a plethora of broken pedal or fractured elements that are not, I guess, singularized in the same sense that Arrvol's Godhead, the singularity of truth. I think this might be the problem for Eric, is it's this boundedness to an idea of a oneness of truth, right? And then he's throwing out objects, but then again, like I said, I want to see how he's going to unfold this, because he's got to be able, that there's too much time in this video for him to not be able to unfold this and bring home the Langen, like singular, everything that's different is synthesized into a sameness. But let's see what he does here. I believe that he'll probably attempt to do so, because Eric, I think, is actually, I've been around the planet more. I think I've, read more than he has, but I think he's throwing himself at these ideas, and he's quickly able to articulate the fractures or where the problems are. But I'm just curious about how this one's going to unfold.
Language. So I started talking about in ordinary language.
Oh shit!
The concept of truth is not like, it doesn't have to get to this philosophical level, because we agree on how to verify. We agree on how to answer questions of truth, right? We agree that if you look in the fridge and see the milk, it's there. Okay, but we're not leaping to the Platonic realm to do that. We're just looking in the fridge, right? So that's the ordinary concept of truth is based on the theory that we have limited knowledge, limited awareness, and we can make mistakes. So it contrasts with a mistake or a lie, right? That's the point of it. But that doesn't mean that there is some objective truth or correspondence between ideas or propositions or sentences and the real world. It just means that in ordinary life, we have like agreed upon ways of making these judgments that we all kind of accept.
So that description of our kind of epistemological limitations, that is all in terms of a correspondence between that account you just gave and the state of affairs.
Well, no, it's just a theory that it compresses the information of experience. I don't have to use your language. I can use my language. I can say, I have a theory that explains the experience. We can, there are many layers of abstraction above embodied experience, but ultimately it's about explaining embodied experience and predicting it and generating action within it. So it's all about that. It's not about like correspondence to some ultimate reality, because I don't have any way of comparing something to ultimate reality, right? I mean, if your Platonic thing was in your Platonic theory, then you could never make a truth claim. There's no verification method. Because you can't jump into the Platonic realm, right?
Well, no, because we are basically in that now. The idea is that we're composed of these universal forms.
But you make mistakes.
Yes, right.
Well, so then that means you're not perfectly communing with the Platonic realm. So all you can do when you make a mistake is analyze the data more carefully, or go back to the fridge and take another look, or whatever, right? You can't leap into the it's like the counterfactual. You can't leap into the other universe and see what happens in the game. And you can't leap into the Platonic realm of forms and see, oh, is there really milk in the fridge according to the Platonic, is that proposition floating in the Platonic soup, or whatever.
Answers like that are obviously absurd, and that it doesn't hurt.
Well, I'm pointing out that it doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't add anything, because no matter what.
No, it does something in mathematics at the highest level. So if the claim is that reality is composed of these basic units of meaning, these mathematical structures, these relations and universals, rather than it's composed of only these particular things, if it's composed of relations and universals, which is mathematics, basically, then when we deal with mathematical truth, we can explain why it is that we can discover.
There's mathematics that relates to other variables in mathematics, and then the idea of physics, where the math is appropriated to the world. I agree with Eric, but I disagree with him. It's just simply not correct to mistake that which is possible in theoretical math with having necessary correspondence in physics. Once again, and then this idea that math, because the symbols referent the universal relative to particulates, it's once again his preference to go there, which that's what Langen does. And yet that's where I think there's an error, because there's always an ex parte difference that is not quite matching. And that was bared out, I think, in my critique of Eric at the beginning, saying, trying to talk about more of just his appeal to a universalistic singularity of truth. And the error was when he was speaking about translation. The translation is this way. And I read it, at least. I guess I could ask him to clarify that he believes that the meaning of all translatability is actually conveyed, that the semantic power of some item in one language necessarily can be conveyed without the variance of different translators to people within the other language. I don't think that occurs with people within the monolinguistic culture. I just think it's a type kind of error. I'd be curious actually to know how many languages Langen speaks, because I'm guessing it's probably fluently only one.
Discover mathematical structures that then have parallels in the material world. We can explain how it is that mathematical truths can be true before we actually discover them. Because the idea that
that's where you slipped. That's where you introduced your objectivity assumption. Like I can explain everything you said up to that point. I can explain how where mathematics comes from, why mathematics works, and all that stuff. But I'm not required to. The only thing that makes objective truth a requirement is when you impose it explicitly, like you just did.
No, it's not that it's a requirement generally. It's that it is useful in explaining how mathematical truth can subsist. That was the original point. And if you're saying the problem with your account in saying that it is just a formalization, a language that we develop out of our innate capacities, then you can't deal with the potential truth of any mathematical structure that has not yet been formalized. You can't deal with basically you would have to say, if it's not true or false before someone actualizes it, then before the Pythagorean theorem was discovered, it was neither true nor false. And that to me seems absurd.
Well, right? No, like I said before, the Pythagorean theorem is true within the system of geometry.
Okay, so
like a given chess game.
Before geometry existed, Was the Pythagorean theorem true or false?
Well, it's not true, or it's not time relative, right? It's system relative. So it's true or false within the system of geometry.
The system of geometry doesn't exist by itself.
But like,
it only exists when interpreted by human beings.
it's a human.
Right? Symbols don't like have reality as symbols by themselves. If you,
Why not, Eric?
wrote down alpha, beta on a page, and there was no human there to read it, those symbols are not objectively alpha and beta.
Why not?
And earlier,
Everything
you
else
pointed
you're
out
pulling
that
in,
you
why
can
not
take a
that?
sentence in one language and translate to another, and then there's this meaning that we can imagine. Okay, but the meaning doesn't have any, real existence in the sense that a rock exists. It's just a construct. Like if I promise.
Well, that's your problem. You're assuming it's just a construct.
Well, okay. Sure, that's my theory. This is all theory, sure, but
right. We're trying to
what I'm
see
saying is
things explains the nature of mathematical truth better. That was
you were saying that too, though. That's the point, right?
What?
Well, okay. So, are you saying that in your Platonic? Well, okay. So, meanings, ideas, representations, right? Yes, I'm saying they're constructs, and they're not objects.
Explain. How is that useful? What does that account for in reality? What does that
Your Platonic realm of? Sorry, what? Sorry, say that again. What?
Well, you're saying you are postulating that propositions are purely constructed, that they have no mind-independent existence. And I'm asking, what does that explain? I'm saying giving them mind-independent existence allows us to explain how mathematical truth could subsist outside of any particular human observer.
Which is not something we need to explain.
Why? No, but
why would we need to explain?
Why would we need to explain that? Because the implication, I'm using a reductio ad absurdum. If you take your assumption and truth only subsists in human minds, or you say within a system, but the system has to be contained within a human mind to have meaning in the first place. So you're effectively saying truth can only exist in human minds.
No, look, I've distinguished. Look, we can distinguish between different instances of an idea. Like you can distinguish between different instances of a gene in DNA and the abstract gene, which consists only of information. But then you can ask the question, where does the gene exist? You could say, well, it exists in all the instances simultaneously or spread over time or whatever. But it's really just an idea that we have constructed to tie those things together. Right? And so
now basically we're just getting down to realism versus nominalism. You're saying you're a nominalist, effectively.
I don't even know what that means. I don't think I'm a nominalist. I think maybe representationalist would be better.
Well,
I
name
believe
alone is nominalism.
Well, no, I don't. I think these terms refer to like some old stuff from a long time ago before people understood the brain and evolution and stuff like that. Maybe it's better to, leave those terms in the past because I don't think they really make sense in light of our current understanding of psychology.
Use whatever term you want. Let's back up though, because you said that I'm asking what it explains to suppose that propositions are purely mental constructs. You said what explains is what now?
I'm confused. I don't know what you're asking.
I'm saying that if propositions are mind independent, then we can explain how mathematical truth can subsist as objective, as real, and true outside of human cognition.
Okay, and I'm saying there's no need to explain that because we are making judgments from the perspective of humans. So we're not in a position of a universe without humans or a universe without ourselves. We are making the judgments. We are using these things to think. So
I mean, this is like more straightforwardly. How is it that a mathematical discovery is made? Because there are some mathematical claims that turn out to be false. They're proved false.
Right.
Exactly. There are other mathematical truths that turn out to be true. Now, were they true or false? A potential mathematical claim is
I've already answered this several times. It's within the system of mathematics. You can't say true or false without qualifying it. If we're in philosophy, if we're not in the ordinary language, but if we're in philosophy, then we can't use these terms loosely. I'm saying there's no meaning to those terms unless we're qualifying them. There's no meaning to say this mathematical statement is true unless we understand that means it's true within mathematics. So it means it follows from the axioms and the rules of inference of mathematics. And the truth is that the theorems are discovered inductively. Somebody guesses, maybe this is the theorem, then they try to prove it, and then they think they have a proof, which is a valid chain of inferences from the axioms, but maybe they make a mistake. Right. Somebody checks it, says, oh, you're wrong. Right? So the theorem is inductively, to any individual, it's inductive, it's uncertain, it's empirical. To the system, it is deductive, because we define the truths of mathematics as those statements within mathematics that are derivable by the rules of inference from the axioms of mathematics. And that's it.
Yeah, and they can be spun out indefinitely, right? There's an infinite number of potential mathematical truths, right?
Right.
Right.
Because you design the system in such a way that it generates an infinite number of possible theorems.
Okay, so now I guess, again, we're getting back to why does mathematics work at all? It's not just an arbitrary set of axioms. It corresponds to computable processes. It corresponds to the kinds of mathematical calculations that can be done in this reality. Surely there are other kinds of mathematical calculations that cannot be done.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there might be other. When you say mathematics corresponds to the kinds of mathematical calculations that can be done, that's just a tautology, right? Because you said mathematical. Now, if you're saying mathematics covers every possible kind of information processing, I don't know. How would I know?
That'd be absurd.
Okay, what I'm getting at is, let's just look at within the formal system, and it's not just one formal system, obviously there are many formal systems, many different sets of axioms that are used in math, but within the collection of human mathematical languages, there are infinitely many deductive conclusions that could be arrived at. You're claiming it's inductive. I think you're not right on that, but let's not.
I'm clarifying the nature of it, that we arrive at these things inductively. You know that, because you know you can make a mistake. So, it's not like we just commune with the, magic realm of mathematical truths and just the theorems just are there or something. We have to constructively persuade ourselves.
I think.
See, Eric is caught up in kind of this ecstatic oneness with God and this elation that he attributes to having a high IQ or some sort of idea of an ideal Godhead, and he's ultimately, once again, he's going to keep reiterating this. So it is interesting, though, that the other guy isn't able to get into the particulate caveats that language could afford. Now these guys are tossing around what I think are generalizations. They need to get more caught up in the weeds here.
I think induction is not just through experience, right? Induction is looking at many cases and then generalizing a theory from many particulars, and that's not what we're doing. We are doing deductive.
But we can call it something if you want to be. I mean, yes, we're not inducing it in that way necessarily, although that can be part of the process of arriving at a theorem. But what I mean, so maybe you don't use the term inductive, but it's empirical, because you have to step through. You have to find the proof.
I just found my
and verify the proof. Right, so it's kind of like you're exploring a city,
using it.
And you're making a map as you explore the city, right? And you could, become confused and make a mistake drawing the map or something like that. But you're exploring the space that is defined by the axioms of mathematics and the rules of inference. And
I didn't want to have to go to this yet, but what about Gödel incompleteness? The whole idea is that there are mathematical truths that are not contained in a formal set of axioms. They cannot be calculated. Formal set of complete axioms.
Basically, Gödel's incompleteness theorem is really just that you can construct self-referential paradoxes within mathematics. So some statements are their truth value is not determined. They're
not paradox.
Undecidable.
With paradox necessarily in Gödel incompleteness. That self-reference.
Well, he's basically just constructing this sentence is false in mathematics. That's all it really is.
No, but the point is not to generate paradoxes. The point is to generate claims, that is propositions, to generate mathematical propositions that cannot be proven using the axioms of the system, and yet we can.
Why would there not be an indefinite amount of paradoxical claims then? He's trying to say what the motivation is, but
through an informal kind of reasoning that they are true.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. Give me an example of something we know is true informally, but can't prove.
I would have to, reiterate what Gödel did with Gödel numbering, and I don't obviously remember.
Well, again, the Gödel, the whole. Well, yeah, as far as I understand it, it's just. It is just what, as I described it. It's that some statements, because of self-reference, can be undecidable. So that the statements that you can construct in mathematics, if you allow yourself self-reference, are not dividable into truth, into the true statements of mathematics and the false ones. There's
I'm saying that is not the result, and I'm not going to be able to prove this because I can't remember all the details of what Gödel did. But the point was that there are results that are not like calculable true or false. They're not provably true or false using like a set of axioms and a set of logical operations. But that the conclusion is not that those things cannot be decided. The point is that we can actually know them to be true or false.
Well, I don't think that's the case. I mean, that's
my battery.
Read Gödel's paper, go through whatever summaries you need to. That is
I could, but I mean, we have our version of this in computing science, right? It's the diagonalization proofs and uncomputability theory and all that stuff. And I mean, I think it's all the same, but yeah, I have,
young guys,
that sort of thing on my shelf if I really wanted to go. Because it's one of these things that seems kind of mysterious, and so people they use it to sort of they use it as a mysticism is appealing to ignorance to support a positive claim, and I think people use Gödel's incompleteness theorem in that way. And I don't really think it says very much, actually. I don't think it's all that interesting.
Well, people should look into it for themselves. My claim is that what Gödel incompleteness proves is that there are true propositions that we can know to be true that are not calculable.
But how do we know that they're true, and in what sense are they true?
It's like a kind of informal reasoning that you do, and mathematical reasoning is never purely within the axioms of the system. There are always kind of prior reasoning processes that go into constructing the system in the first place, and they're.
Well, I mean, if that were the case, then what you would do is you would widen the definition of mathematics to include whatever these informal reasoning things are, and then it would become decidable. But that's not. I don't think that's the point. The point is that there are undecidable statements within the language of mathematics.
Using the methods of proof acceptable within that axiomatic framework, but not that they're undecidable. Period. The point is, no one complete formal system can be fully decidable. Well, using its own axioms. I mean, look, you can just say the sentence is false, right? I mean, that's a very simple example. You don't have to get into mathematics. It's an undecidable statement because it's not true or false. It's circular and has a negation in it. It just loops forever. Right? So it's like to determine the truth value of the sentence, you have to know the truth value of the sentence. And since you can never know that, you can never answer the question, is it true or false? So it's very easy to construct undecidable statements in English, right? But I don't see what this has to do with what we're talking about. Yeah, well, going back to, let's just look at the issue of mathematics again. So by postulating a real existence for propositions and also relations and universals in other contexts, we can make claims about how a mathematician discovers a mathematical truth, because the truth value was already there before they actually formulated the system. So when you lay down a set of axioms, it would seem that in your view, simultaneously, there are generated an infinite set of true propositions that can be decided within those axioms.
Yeah, you've defined a representational space, and within that space are an infinite set of, like again, chess isn't infinite, but define the rules of chess. Now you could define a space that has a certain set of possible games in it.
Right, and so is it true then, the moment you first lay down the axioms, you haven't tried to test out their implications, are every single one of those mathematical propositions that can be said about that system true or false before we actually
with respect to what?
With respect to the axioms of the system.
Well, they're true or false with respect to the axioms of the system. Once when you define the system, you define whether they're true or false with respect to it.
Yeah, see, I get that.
So I mean, it's not something that exists in the world. Like maybe you're confusing the idea, like the system as an abstract concept. It's like the gene as an abstract concept. It's just we can think about the system in and of itself, right, as a set of ideas separate from any brain having the system in it, right? But the system does not exist. So the system does not exist as like an object. It's just something that we can, think about. It's just a possible thing we could imagine, like the game of chess, right? It's something. Like the game of chess.
Then of these true or false propositions. So I'm saying you lay down a set of axioms. There's an infinite set of propositions that can truly or falsely characterize those axioms. You're agreeing that there is that infinite set of propositions, but how because you're saying that there is that infinite set of propositions that would agree with the axioms.
By the system.
That there's only ever look what. Sorry, I'm acting as if I'm talking directly to Eric. But Eric, there are only the number of propositions that have been made about the system within the system. There's not there's not a counterfactual, overarching, universal set of all propositions. That itself would become contradictory. And so this idea that you keep putting forth is like an appeal to universalism now. And it's, I don't, meaning I wish, I wish I don't know. I think I'm upset because I see it as like I don't want to fully agree with the blithering genius guy, but I just think that Eric's adding a superfluous layer that because they can talk about an indefinite set of propositions that then means, or like it's a lie, meaning you're still only at the current set of propositions. There's not a field of preset, it's that whole like potentia for there to be the sparrow must exist before the sparrow, but that's assuming like a universal space, like an indefinite universal space, instead of just the particulates that evolved or developed or came into being. But once again, I know Eric's going to have a top-down ontology on this. I mean, that's really his fight, is a fight for God, or a fight for a universal oneness that's there. And so he's going to use what I think is a shadow technique that is blurred out by the word universal, or the term all, as if all actually applies to some real referent, instead of just a conceptual idea of what allness is, which itself is limited and contained like in mentally, not
system, and the truth or falsity of them is also defined by the system. Just like whether something's checkmate or not is defined by the rules of chess. Right? So now let's say we went through a time machine and we went back before chess was invented, but we knew what chess was. We had the idea in our heads. We could then play a game of chess, right? Like, of course, this involves time travel, but right? Or two people could independently come up with the same game of chess, or tic-tac-toe maybe, okay? And it would be the same because it's the same, has the same rules, but they came up with it independently. I mean, that's possible, but none of this is really.
Yeah, what I'm getting at is, how does this? It seems like you're saying two contradictory things. You're saying that the set of true propositions that describe the system are like self-referential within that axiomatic structure. They are true. They have truth values, real truth values
within that system. Within that system,
right? But then, like, where does that system exist?
Nowhere. It's just a construct.
They don't exist. Then,
well, let me ask you a question.
Doesn't exist, then neither do the truth values.
Where do laws exist?
Which laws? Like human laws?
Yeah, human laws.
Well,
where does the law against drunk driving exist?
Yeah, I mean, it seems distributed, right? Which is why the theory of forms is helpful.
I wouldn't say it's distributed. It's just it's a construct. We came up with it, so somebody wrote it down. But then, let's say the piece of paper they wrote it down on burns up. That doesn't mean the law ceases to exist. It's just a construct. We constructed it. Like, if I promise to help somebody move tomorrow, and we both forget about it, the promise still exists in some sense that I made it when I uttered the words, "I will help you move tomorrow."
No, but we're totally ignoring with these examples the core problem that I'm pointing to with this issue of mathematical systems. So you're saying they don't exist anywhere, and yet how is there an infinite set of true propositions? How do those truth values subsist if this system doesn't exist anymore?
They don't exist as objects, right?
Yeah.
They're part of the system. So if you get the system into your head, if you learn the system, then you can derive the true and false whatever propositions from it if you want to. Just like if you learn the game of soccer, you can go play soccer, or if you learn the game of chess, you can play chess. So,
okay, but you're saying like the system have a mind independent existence, right?
Well, not physically. I mean, it's not a mind independent existence. What do you mean by mind independent existence? It's like
I guess not dependent on any one mind. Like the system of mathematical axioms we're talking about could exist in any number of minds, right?
Sure, it's like the sentence, "There is milk in the fridge." Could be said by many people, right? The English language exists in many minds. Where does it actually exist? Where does the actual English language exist? Well, it's kind of a fiction that we made up, right? But it's not really a fiction. It exists in this, again, yeah, sure, you could say it exists in a distributed sense, but that's not really what the English language is, right? It's just, we imagine that it exists in a way to think about it. Because we don't want to think about every single person having a certain structure in the brain, and you know, everybody's version of English language is slightly different.
Applying that,
You have to abstract from all of those things.
Mathematical example, applying that analogy to the example of math, it's what you're arguing is the basic. I'm just going to say the word nominalist point, which is that like we each have a particular state of mind with English language. There is no one universal English language that we're all participating of. It's only ever particulars here and there, right? With mathematical,
I'm not saying that.
What do you say?
Well, I mean, you learned the English language, right? You didn't learn it from one person. You learned it from. I'm saying it. I mean, I'm saying we can think of the English language as existing, but that's sort of a fiction. Just like you can think of a cloud sitting on a mountaintop as an object, when in fact it's just when water vapor enters that region of the air, it condenses, and when it leaves, it evaporates.
That is what you're saying. That is nominalism. So there's no true English language. It's a fiction, meaning it's just a name we give. It's a heuristic, basically. It's a heuristic device, right?
Well, I think there is. I don't know, because I don't know what nominalism is. I'm not going to commit to some term that I don't.
It's just contrasted to Platonic realism.
Yeah, but I don't. I think these old dichotomies are bogus. You know, just like synthetic a priori or whatever. You know, Kant's notions are bogus. I don't buy into that stuff.
People know that unless you read the stuff, and a lot of those guys were smarter than we are today on average.
Well, I don't know about that, but you know, we have a lot of
insights. IQ.
Kant knew nothing about biology or the brain. You know.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that there aren't real insights. I'm just saying, like,
I'm not saying there aren't real insights. I'm saying that let's not
forget the name nominalism, but that is the basic argument is the structure of nominalism. That there's no true English language. There's just it's a useful fiction. You call it a fiction. It's a name that we give to this thing that doesn't really have a universal existence. It's only ever particular. Applying that to the mathematics example, this system of axioms. Okay, where does that system exist? Is it like the English language?
Well, it doesn't have that kind of existence. It's like asking, where does the gene for I don't know, like where does the gene for I'm trying to think of something that says for some enzyme that's in the citric acid cycle, just make up a name. Where does gene 46A exist?
Yeah, I mean, you can't answer it. The Platonic realm is where it exists.
Well, I don't think we need to answer the question. I think it's just it's an idea that I can use to say all of these. I don't know about the word heuristic. It's I can have the idea of the gene consisting of the nucleotide sequence, and I can say that this nucleotide sequence occurs in these billion organisms, right? But the sequence itself does not exist in space and time. It is not an object. That's what I'm saying.
Right, and so there is no such thing as the gene, properly speaking. It's just
there is, but it's not an object. It's not an object.
What is it?
It's the gene. I mean, it's a sequence of nucleotides. It's a particular configuration of nucleotides.
Okay, now they're both just talking past each other. I think Eric's coming up short, and I think the other guy now is trying to double down. He's over exasperated beyond his articulation now, and so the idea of like the fact that we have syntax as a recording device, initially, you know, instead of counting beads in a bag, you have a shared language that then has these relational adjectives that we can put together to formalize what it is we're talking about when we're talking about a law or these systems. But the law, kind of like an argument on morality, right? It's like part of morality is what is written in the law that people abide by. Another part is one's internal relationship to the other entities that we value roughly the same or in common to us. And then another one is the actual witnessing of people's performative behavior that either abides by this kind of latent notion of what a rule system is, or there's a violation or something that's ingressing as a violation on the moral system. That is part of the intra-objective domain of the morality. The idea, like the idea of the ontology of systems, right? Where do they exist? And then just to default to the abstract
like a formalized abstract is kind of what a mathematical system is. It's not that, yeah, there's a bunch of variables floating around, that, a monad and a dyad that represent one and two-ness in some Platonic form that just are attributed through our minds from the Platonic form through our minds to the world. The system itself is kind of a loosely held regulation pattern among a history of people that have been able to note it, articulate it, describe it, and even write it down, hence formalizing it. And then it's the behavior around said formalization. That's where these things exist. They're existing, and so it's weird. Like I actually despise it, and I retract it. I'm not even going to use the word existence here, because they don't persist unless they are in syntax, or unless they persist as a procedural behavior of people. Beyond that, they don't exist in a Platonic form. Once again, I think it's ultimately an irritant to hear Eric appeal to this, and yet it's also. I like the good fight, because he's saying, like, the math is going to point to this space in which all of these things can occur, like pre-existence, in potentia, or in a godly ex nihilo, from nothing, all of a sudden they're there. But I think Eric wants to presume that, kind of like the Matrix, or like everything that you say and do and encounter and whatnot is all coded, let's say, in like an Akashic record that's universal. It's already been flattened, and we're just moving through it, right? And so, with that model, that ideal, that belief, the idea that he's going to try to interpret everything once again, because mathematics can, in that abstract system, generate a formalism that leads to, let's say, an infinity of time, or an unboundedness of time. I shouldn't say infinity necessarily. Once again, it's this attempt to reference that abstract of what is universal, or that which is considered the domain of the Platonic. I almost wouldn't mind flipping the script and asking Eric to fetter out exactly, precisely what he means by the Platonic space. But I do ultimately think this is a lack of reading on Eric's part, meaning the weight of philosophy has gone, I think, towards this other guy's approach, meaning his approach is more akin to my approach and understanding. And yet there's always this caveated hook that allows one to believe that, in fact, there is some Akashic record and a controller, and that all of the information exists prior to our, like, deterministic being integrating into it and discovering it as an abstract inner processed linguistic practice. And so, okay, now we're only at the halfway mark. It's incredible. There we go. And I haven't got that much done on this.
A particular configuration of nucleotides exists in many different places, right?
Sure. Yeah. It is realized in, let's say, 1 billion organisms. But the sequence, so you could say the sequence exists in all of those organisms. But the sequence as an abstract idea or concept is something that we use to identify a relationship between those 1 billion organisms, right? So we abstract this notion. And once we have abstracted it, we're not talking about an object. We're talking about a form, right? Now, this form does not have to
disagree with that guy there.
For us to
You're just saying that. So
yes, I'm saying that. That's right. I'm saying that. There's absolutely no reason to believe. Well, I'm just, hold on. I'm saying, yes, just wait. I'm saying, yes, there's no reason to posit that it has some other existence in some Platonic realm that you cannot see, you cannot observe, you cannot show me, and that has no explanatory power. So yes, I'm saying I don't believe there's some platonic realm out there in which this thing exists as an object or something.
See,
I mean, in what sense?
I am
would it
tracking
exist in
this
the platonic
fine.
realm? Is it an object in that realm? Is it a physical
That's
object?
See, I'm pre. It's almost as if I'm predicting how the conversation is going about based on the words that are leading up to it. So it's kind of an inductive register that allows a prediction based on flow of conversation, but also based on the pegged points in philosophy that have been argued in the past amongst other previous people having not dissimilar arguments. And so it's I mean, I'm glad it's online. I'm not actually certain why it is I'm listening to it or doing this, other than I needed something to backdrop my motivation to paint, and being on camera like forces me to at least lay down some paint, which I've been so slow at lately. Yep, tidbits in life. What can I say? And then to even think, did this form of clowns pre-exist its process configuration? Could there have ever been any erroneous particulate that was embedded in there? The idea not of just a counterfactual, but a counterfeit, right? Like a counterfeit universe or a counterfeit. It belies you to believe that this painting pre-occurred its occurrence, which is precisely the cyclical nature of the kind of spirit that Eric is, and why it is he continues to forward this thing, and a top apex, like a halcyon to bring one's energy and mind and intellect to, I think is really great. And to believe in the apex, to believe in the beyond the apex is fine. The apex is fine to believe in the beyond the apex, but to believe in the quote unquote universal or allness or there-ness that the top of the apex points to seems as if it's as easily derivable to assume a stellation or a cross through the apex that yields an inverse open domain of mirrors, if you will, instead of a mirrors of a plurality instead of mirrors of a singularity. I mean, I really like the guy, blitheringGenius, just met like out of the gate. He's like, look, we can call something flat, but then when you zoom in on it, you can see it's very, very not flat. It's very, very bumpy. And you didn't see Eric address that, right? And just out of the gate, you'd say, well, how do you deal with that contradiction? Is it platonically flat or is it platonically bumpy? Not platonically, but is it truthfully bumpy and platonically flat? Like like I like the way the blitheringGenius guy is using some base, the milk is in the fridge arguments. This is also what Wittgenstein did, which shows that Eric is century is